Welcome to another episode on my channel. Today I will tell you about the events that happened in April 2003 in France. Le Grand Bornand is a beautifully located village in the French Alps in the Upper Savoy department. The village is a ski resort that, due to its general tranquility and almost non-existent nightlife, is ideal for families with children and beginner skiers. On Saturday morning, April 12, 2003, 14-year-old Mario arrived at a large wooden house. The house belongs to his mother and stepfather, and Mario, as agreed, has come to spend the holidays here with them and his half-siblings. But the door of the house is locked, and there is apparently no one inside. Mario isn't too concerned because his mother, Graziella Ortolano, and stepfather, Xavier Flactif, are often away, while his half-sisters and brother Sarah, 11 years old, Letitia, 10, and Gregory, 7, usually practice skiing on weekends. Mario tried to call his mother on her cell phone, but to no avail. The boy waited outside the house for about 3 hours, and finally goes to his mother's friend Christine, who lives nearby. Mario left a note at the door telling Mom where he went. But his mother doesn't call back all day and leaves no message. The next morning the situation is unchanged, so Christine goes with the boy near his parents' house. The house appears empty, but this time it is possible to go inside, as one of the doors is open. Mario and Christine immediately notice that the house, at least at first glance, is in perfect order, which is actually very unusual for a family with several children. However, there is no one in the house. Nevertheless, 2 computers are turned on, which is also strange. But even stranger according to Mario is what he finds in the upstairs bedrooms. There are no sheets, pillows or quilts in the beds. Mario goes to the police. He says he's disturbed by what he finds in the house. He also reports that his mother wouldn't have gone anywhere without informing him, or having someone give him such a message. Police officers do not take this report lightly. Several of them go to the Flactif house, but find nothing more than what Mario himself noticed. The officers look for witnesses, asking everyone around if anyone saw anything. They also gather basic information about the Flactif family. They already know that 4 years ago Xavier and Graziella came here with their children from the north of France, and from the beginning they planned to settle here for a long time. Xavier is a construction entrepreneur, and has had a lot of success, although, they said in the industry, he hasn't always played fair. Besides, as all his friends confirm, as a person Xavier is open, cheerful and very sociable. Business is going very well for him here in Le Grand Bornand too, and his family can afford luxuries. There are 4 cars and several motorcycles in the garage, and their comfortably furnished house is 300 square meters in size. There are, by the way, several other houses in the neighborhood that also belong to Xavier, so one must certainly take into account the fact that there may be some jealous people. Even one of the neighbors says so on TV. The media is already all over Le Grand Bornand, as the case of the disappearance of the family of 5 is sensational and full of drama. Speculation is multiplying, and the investigators themselves are beginning to consider that the Flactif family was kidnapped due to some sort of business spat. Xavier has had quite a few such scuffles in the course of running his business. On April 17, a few days after the family was reported missing, the prosecutor's office orders a search of the house. A full refrigerator and food practically ready to be reheated in a pot are facts that reinforce everyone's belief that the family was supposed to have spent the weekend here. Investigators are also struck by how meticulously clean the living room is, contrasted by the clutter and damage on the first floor, cut pieces of floor covering, ripped off sections of wallpaper. The team securing the traces begins to search each room literally centimeter by centimeter. After several hours of work, the professionals find a broken-off piece of tooth that lies in a crevice between the floorboards. They find a total of 7 such pieces, all between the boards. They immediately transfer the material to the laboratory. Behind a curtain in the living room, they find a bullet casing from a small-size weapon, as well as small traces of blood. Investigators at this point already know that they are dealing with a crime scene. Since the house is very large, they decide to pull an additional group of forensic technicians to speed up the labor-intensive task of securing traces. Support arrives the very next day, April 18th. Everyone is working very intensively. spraying the interior with luminol, a substance that glows in places where there were traces of blood before, even if they were cleaned up. Makes it clear that a real drama took place here. Traces of blood were everywhere, on all floors. It's also clear that someone was dragged down the stairs. However, it is still uncertain whose footprints they are. Was the family abducted? The prosecutor's office orders a comparison of DNA from the blood found in the house with that of other members of the Flactif family, but the results have to wait a while. A week later, Xavier's car is found. It is parked in a multi-story parking lot belonging to the Geneva airport. The car is transported to France. Forensic technicians secure traces in it. They find that fragments of the lining under the feet are missing, and the lining from the trunk is completely gone. There are numerous blood stains in the car. Its samples are also sent to the laboratory. On July 15th, the results of the DNA tests arrive. What was previously assumed is now absolutely certain. The traces of blood, both from the house and the car, belong to members of the Flactif family, mother, father, and 3 children. But there is still some 6 DNA, mixed with the victim's DNA. Its code is not in the state data registry. The owner of this DNA automatically becomes the prime suspect. The police assume that this person should be sought somewhere in the circle of the missing, so they are organizing a large-scale investigation to collect DNA samples from people living in the area. About 300 people are involved. Each of them is asked if he or she would be willing to donate blood samples for the test, since, naturally, it is voluntary. All those asked volunteer for the test without resistance, but there is one exception. It is David Hodiat, a 31-year-old neighbor of the missing. Of course, his refusal immediately draws attention. In addition, the investigators have already heard of David Hodiat. During the activities carried out in the house of the missing family, one of the technicians noticed that for hours someone had been watching their work through binoculars. It was determined to be a neighbor of the missing, David Hodiat. It has now also been associated that a few days after the family's disappearance, he was the one who made statements on TV about how Xavier's wealth could have been the cause of someone's jealousy. The policeman explained to David that his lack of consent might seem suspicious, so the man finally relents and agrees to have his blood drawn. Investigators asked the laboratory to quickly analyze this sample. The result arrives after 48 hours. The DNA code of David Hodiat matches that of the 6 DNA found at the crime scene. Police determine that David has 2 young children with his partner Alexandra. He is a car mechanic, she is a cleaner. Both have lived in Le Grand Bornand for 2 years. Investigators learn that David and Alexandra have temporarily rented a house from Xavier, and that they are in conflict with him. During the holidays, Xavier Flactif preferred to rent the house to vacationers, and David and Alexandra had to move elsewhere with their children for that time. In the media, Alexandra also spoke about the family of the missing in a far-from-kind manner. It is also known that David and Alexandra have almost no contact with their neighbors, while they are friends with Stefan H. and his wife Isabel. Residents report that the 2 men go out at night with canisters and pump petrol out of cars and steal car parts. The police officers so far have no solid evidence that David has anything to do with the disappearance of the Flactif family, so they decide to adopt a strategy of action that will allow them to gather as much circumstantial evidence as possible pointing to his guilt. So the investigators monitor David's phone conversations and follow him on all his car trips. Eventually, the strategy begins to work. On one occasion, Alexandra confesses to David that she has been feeling uncomfortable since April. A similar expression also appears in other statements by the couple. On another occasion, Alexandra confesses that she does not trust Isabel. We can guess which Isabel she is referring to, but neither she nor David say anything specific. On September 17th, after weeks of observation, the police arrest all 4. David and Alexandra's apartment is searched. In the garage, police officers find toys belonging to the children of the Flactif family, as well as many other things, including ski equipment and other items of greater or lesser value. David gives a statement after just half an hour of questioning. He says that on the fateful day he went to the villa, where Xavier's children were already there, and waited with them for their father. When Xavier returned, he started a conversation with him that turned into an argument. The situation escalated. David claims that he acted in the heat of the moment. He took out the gun he was carrying, shot Xavier first, then the two older children, and then the third child, who was upstairs in the room, and finally Xavier's wife Graziella. David claims he acted irrationally. When he came to his senses, he was frightened of the consequences. So he loaded the bodies into his car, took a couple of petrol canisters and drove to a forest located about 10 kilometers from Le Grand Bornand. There he piled the bodies one on top of the other, along with the bedding they were wrapped in, watered them with petrol and set them on fire. After 3 hours, the bodies were burned. David adds that a few days later he drove Xavier's car back to the parking lot at the airport to cover his tracks. What is striking about this testimony is that the man supposedly acted completely alone, yet it takes an enormous amount of force, as well as time, to carry 5 bodies out of the house, load them into the car, take them out of the car, arrange them, and so on. The 300 square meter house still had to be thoroughly cleaned at the end. Investigators absolutely do not believe that David acted alone. He, however, insists on it. Instead, he is ready to lead the police to the place where he burned the bodies. However, at the indicated location in the forest, there is almost nothing but a relatively small amount of burned wood. Forensic technicians eventually find several small pieces of bone. Analysis of their DNA confirms that the bones belong to members of the Flactif family. Since the specialists are sure that David could not have burned all 5 bodies in such a short period of time and acted alone in doing so, they decide to conduct an experiment. It looks as follows. The investigators recreate the scene that David described using dead pigs. This is justified because pig meat has a structure and properties similar to human flesh. It soon becomes clear that what David said can't be right, as after 3 hours the meat is about 20% burned. The experiment continues, and after some time the experts know something else. To completely burn the corpses of 5 people, about 800 kilograms of wood are needed. Naturally, such a supply of wood had to be prepared in advance, and this precludes both acting in an affair and acting alone. The 3 other interrogators do not know what David told the police officers, but they testify similarly. David acted alone and he was the murderer. However, as time passes, the interrogators begin to say more and more. Stefan confesses that the murder was planned beforehand. 2 days before the crime, that is, on April 9th, he went together with David to Xavier's house. The plan was that Stefan would strangle the children with a string he took with him, and David would shoot their parents. But at the door Stefan suddenly changed his mind and backed off. The men began to argue, and David accused Stefan of cowardice. Alexandra, on the other hand, testifies that David wanted his own house, but couldn't afford it. The woman says that David once watched a program about a serial killer who called himself Alfredo Stranieri and murdered his victims in order to appropriate their property. Alexandra says that after watching that program, David said he wanted to act similarly, adding, "This idiot fell because he buried the bodies. At my place they won't find anything, because I'll burn them." According to Alexandra, since watching the Stranieri program, David has been obsessively thinking about murdering Xavier's family. Based on this testimony, David is charged with murder and taken into custody, while the other 3 are accused of covering up the crime and obstructing the investigation. Investigators want to reconstruct the exact course of events, so they are analyzing blood traces from the crime scene. The size, form, and distribution of such traces make it possible to infer how they were created, for example, whether as a result of blunt force blows or from gunfire. It is also possible to determine the position of the victim's body at the time the wounds were inflicted, as well as who sustained what wounds. These findings are compared with testimonies and thus verify their accuracy. The results of the analysis are as follows. First, not all the victims, as David claims, were killed by gunfire. Only Xavier was shot. Other traces indicate that the deaths of his wife and children occurred from blunt force blows. Analysis of the Flactif's phone calls establishes that Xavier must have died later than his wife, as he was still on the phone with someone after 6 p.m. It is known, in turn, that the children returned from school after 5 p.m., so Xavier must have been the last to die. It becomes clear to investigators that 7-year-old Gregory and 10-year-old Sarah were the first to die. Here's what really played out on Friday, April 11, 2003 at the Flactif family home. The murderer enters the house. In the living room sits 7-year-old Gregory and 11-year-old Sarah. Gregory is attacked first. Seeing this, Sarah tries to run away. The murderer catches up with her at the front door and inflicts blows on her as well. Then he goes to the floor, where 10-year-old Letitia tries to hide behind the bed. You can imagine what this child experienced. First she heard the deathly screams of her siblings, followed by silence. And then the girl heard the creaking of the stairs, 27 steps to be exact, each creaking, and then the murderer entered her room and got her as she hid behind her bed in a curled position. At the time, Graziella was in the laundry room, which lies in another part of the house, and most likely heard nothing and had no idea that her children were dead. The murderer attacked her when she came out of the laundry room and into the living area. Graziella was also bludgeoned with a blunt instrument. Later, Xavier entered the house. He immediately had to see the bodies of his 2 children lying on the floor. He also saw David Hodiat. Xavier rushed toward him. A tug-of-war ensued between the men. David took out his gun and fired. Investigators present David with the findings of the forensic analysis. David, and later Stefan, admit that they burned the bodies for days. David claims that his consciousness was disturbed during the commission of the act. However, psychiatrists find no disorder in him or any of the other 3 defendants. Nor is there any basis for concluding that they were unable to act rationally and that their responsibility is limited. A month and a half later, David retracts all his previous testimony and claims that he had nothing to do with the murders. In 2006, David Hodiat is sentenced to life imprisonment. He will have a possible chance to go free after serving at least 22 years of his sentence. Stefan H. gets a 15-year sentence for his involvement in the crime, and Alexandra L. and Isabel H. receive sentences of 10 and 7 years in prison, respectively. And this is the end of this story. Thank you for listening, and until next time, take care of yourself and goodbye for now.